In 1890, a 12-year-old farm boy in Ohio could keep his family alive through a Midwest winter with nothing but an axe and the knowledge in his head. He knew which trees would burn hot and which would smolder and choke. He knew how to stack a cord so the wind dried it for free. Today, most grown men cannot start a fire without a squirt of lighter fluid. But here is the twist. Number 9 on this list was so important that getting it wrong could burn your house down by February. And number 3 is a trick the U.S. Forest Service still cannot improve on. These were not hobbies, they were survival, passed from father to son around the woodpile. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because some of these skills might save you this winter. Let us count down the 25 lost firewood skills every rural boy once knew by heart. Number 25, reading a standing dead tree. Before a boy ever swung an axe, he learned to read the woods with his eyes. A standing dead tree, what the old-timers called a snag, was free firewood already half-seasoned by the wind. The bark would be loose and peeling, the top branches bare and gray, the wood beneath still sound and dry. A boy learned to tell a tree that died last year, perfect for the stove, from one that died a decade ago and had gone soft and punky inside. He would knock the trunk with the back of his axe and listen. A solid ring meant good wood. A dull thud meant rot. Cutting a green living tree meant a year of waiting before it would burn. But a good snag could go straight from the woods to the woodshed. Knowing the difference saved a boy a whole season. Number 24, the thunk test for seasoned wood. There was no moisture meter in 1900. A boy's ears were the moisture meter. He learned to take 2 split pieces of wood and knock them together, listening for the sound. Green, wet wood gave a dull, heavy thunk, like hitting a wet sandbag. Properly seasoned wood rang out sharp and hollow, almost musical, like 2 bones clapping together. The drier the wood, the higher and clearer the ring. He could also turn a piece over and look at the cut ends. Seasoned wood showed cracks radiating out from the center like spokes on a wheel, the checks that opened as the moisture left. Gray, dull ends with no cracks meant the wood was still too wet to burn clean. Burning green wood wasted half its heat just boiling off the water inside, and a boy who knew the thunk never made that mistake. Number 23, splitting with the grain. A boy quickly learned that wood does not split where you want it to. It splits where it wants to. The secret was reading the grain before the axe ever came down. He looked for the natural lines running the length of the log, the existing cracks fanning out from the heart of the wood, and he aimed for those. He learned to split from the bark side toward the center on a stubborn round, and to attack the edges of a big piece rather than the dead middle. Knotty wood, where a branch once grew, he set aside or worked around, because a knot would swallow an axe and laugh. A skilled boy could halve a round in a single stroke by placing the blade along a check the wood had already started. The wood did most of the work. He just showed it where to break. Number 22, the maul, the wedge, and the axe. A real woodsman never used one tool when the job called for 3. A boy learned that a felling axe, thin and sharp, was for cutting across the grain and chopping down trees, never for splitting. Split with a felling axe, and you would bury it in a knotty round and bend the handle, trying to free it. For splitting, he reached for the maul, that heavy blunt wedge on a handle, 8 pounds of momentum that cracked rounds open by force rather than sharpness. And for the truly stubborn pieces, the great oak butts and the twisted elm, he drove steel wedges with a sledge, working 2 or 3 into a single crack until the wood surrendered with a groan. Using the wrong tool ruined both the tool and the boy's afternoon. The right tool turned an hour of frustration into 10 minutes of clean work. Number 21, keeping an edge. "A dull axe is more dangerous than a sharp one," every father told his son, "because a dull blade glances instead of bites." So a boy learned to sit on the porch step of an evening with a file and a whetstone, drawing the metal across the edge at just the right angle until it could shave the hair off his forearm. He learned to push the file away from his body in smooth strokes, to feel for the burr forming on the back of the blade, then to polish that burr away on the stone. A well-kept axe head was wiped with an oily rag against rust and never left out in the rain. The boy who kept his edge could fell a tree in half the strokes with half the sweat and twice the safety. The lazy boy who let it dull paid for it in blisters and near misses. Number 20. Hanging a new handle. Here is where things get serious. Sooner or later, every axe handle cracked. A boy out on a homestead could not run to a hardware store. He learned to knock out the broken stub, sometimes burning it free in the coals, and to shape a new handle from a length of straight-grained hickory. He would whittle and rasp the new helve until the eye of the axe head slid down snug, then drive it home and split the top of the handle to drive in a wooden wedge, sometimes a steel one crossways for good measure. A handle hung wrong would let the head fly off mid-swing, a deadly accident waiting to happen. A handle hung right would outlast the boy who made it. This was patient, careful work, and a boy was not trusted to swing an axe in earnest until he could first prove he could mend one. Number 19. The crosscut saw. Before chainsaws screamed through the woods, there was the misery whip, that long two-man crosscut saw with teeth like a shark. A boy on one end and his father or brother on the other, they fell into a rhythm, pull and pull, never push, letting the saw do the cutting. The cardinal rule a boy learned fast was that you never pushed the saw, you only pulled your stroke, and let your partner pull theirs, or the long blade would buckle and bind. They kept the cut wide with a wedge tapped behind the blade so the weight of the log would not pinch the saw and trap it. A sharp crosscut, well set, would sing through a foot-thick oak. A good pair of sawyers could buck a whole tree into stove lengths before noon, and the steady shush-shush of the blade was the sound of winter being made ready. Number 18. Bucking to stove length. Once a tree was down, it had to be cut into burnable pieces, and a boy learned that the length mattered more than people think. Every wood stove and fireplace had its own mouth, and the wood had to fit it with an inch or two to spare. He learned to measure a stick against his axe handle, or to cut a notched gauge stick so every piece came out the same length, which mattered enormously when it came time to stack. Mismatched lengths made a sloppy, tumbling woodpile. Uniform length stacked tight and solid. He cut the rounds where the log lay, rolling each section clear, and he kept the saw cut square so the pieces would stand on end for splitting. A boy who eyeballed it ended up with pieces too long for the firebox, and there was nothing worse than carrying an armload of wood inside on a cold night, only to find half of it would not fit the stove. Number 17. Snaking logs out of the woods. Cutting a tree was only half the battle. A felled tree might be a quarter-mile from the woodshed, across a creek and up a hill, and there was no truck to fetch it. So a boy learned the old art of skidding, snaking the logs out behind a horse or a team of oxen with a chain and a cant hook. He learned to roll a heavy log with that long-handled hook to set the chain so the log's nose rode up over roots and stones instead of digging in, and to walk well clear of a log that might suddenly slide on a downhill pitch. On smaller jobs, he hauled the wood himself with a sledge or a stone boat dragged over frozen ground, for winter was actually the easiest time to move wood when the snow let the load slide. Getting the wood home was a skill all its own, and a strong back was not enough without a clever head. Number 16. The Widowmaker. The woods could kill a careless boy, and the most feared danger had a name that told you everything. A widowmaker was a broken branch or a dead limb hung up overhead, ready to fall the instant you disturbed the tree below. A boy learned to look up before he ever looked down, scanning the canopy for hanging deadwood, leaning snags, and branches lodged where they did not belong. He learned never to work beneath a tree caught in the arms of another, never to fell into a thicket of dead standing timber, and to plan his escape path before the first cut so he could step clear when the tree began to go. The old men of the community could each name a neighbor killed by a falling limb. That memory kept the lesson sharp. A boy who respected the widowmaker grew into an old man himself. Number 15, which wood burns best. Not all wood is created equal, and a boy learned the heat of every species the way a city child learns his multiplication tables. Hickory, oak, ash, and locust were the kings, dense hardwoods that burned long and hot and threw real warmth into a cold kitchen. Maple and birch were good, honest, middle-grade wood, but pine, spruce, and the softwoods he saved for kindling and quick fires because they burned fast, threw sparks and coated the chimney with creosote. He learned that a stick of oak held twice the heat of a stick of poplar of the same size, so an oak woodpile meant fewer trips to the shed in January. The boy who filled his woodshed with soft cottonwood because it split easy would be shivering by February. The boy who labored over the hard, knotty hickory in October would be warm clear through to spring. Number 14. The Firewood Rhyme. Country families passed down their wood knowledge in verse, the same way they passed down weather signs and planting dates. A boy grew up reciting the old firewood poem the way he said his prayers. Oak logs will warm you well, the rhyme went, if they are old and dry. Ashwood wet and ashwood dry, a king may warm his slippers by. The verses ran through every common tree, warning that elm wood burns like churchyard mold, that poplar gives a bitter smoke, that fir and pine will fill your eyes. It sounds like a children's game, but every line carried real instruction, a memory aid drilled into a boy, so that even half asleep on a freezing morning, he would reach for the right log. The rhyme outlived the men who first sang it, and a few old families in the hills can still recite every verse today. Number 13, splitting kindling. A boy learned early that a roaring fire is built from a whisper. You could not light a log with a match. You needed kindling, those thin, dry splinters that catch a flame and pass it up the line. So he took a hatchet and a block and split his stove wood down into finger-thin sticks, working the blade down through a piece set on end and rocking it free. The smartest boys learned to hold the wood and the hatchet together and bring them down on the block as one, so the blade was never swung loose toward the hand. He kept a box of dry kindling by the stove at all times, refilling it each evening so the morning fire could be lit with cold hands in the dark. The fire on a January morning lived or died by the kindling box, and the boy who let it run empty answered for it. Number 12, fat wood and pine knots. Here is one almost nobody remembers. In a stand of old pine where a tree had fallen and rotted away, a boy could find the heart and the knots soaked through with hardened resin, the dense amber-colored wood the old folks called fat wood, lighter knot, or fat lighter. This was nature's own fire starter. A few thin shavings of fat wood would catch from a single match and burn with a hot, oily flame that would light damp kindling when nothing else could. A boy learned to dig the old pine stumps and split out the resin-soaked heart, and a family would keep a basket of it by the hearth all winter. One good pine knot could smolder for an hour. The Forest Service and modern campers still hunt fatwood today because no factory fire starter has ever truly beaten a sliver of resin-soaked pine that a boy could find for free in the woods behind the barn. Number 11. Birch bark tinder. Where the white birch grew, a boy never wanted for tinder. The papery outer bark of the birch tree is packed with flammable oils, and it will catch a flame even when wet, even in a driving snow. He learned to peel only the loose, curling outer layers, never to strip the tree bare and kill it, and to keep a wad of the dry curls tucked in his coat pocket for emergencies. A handful of birch bark, fluffed up and lit, burned hot enough to dry and ignite the kindling stacked above it. For a boy caught out in the cold woods at dusk, knowing where to find birch bark was the difference between a warm camp and a frozen night. It was the first lesson of the woods and the last line of defense, a skill that has saved lives for as long as there have been people in the northern forests. Number 10. Char cloth, flint, and steel. Long before matches were cheap and common, and on every homestead where they ran short, a boy knew how to make fire from a spark. He carried a tinder box with a piece of flint, a curved steel striker, and a tin of char cloth, scraps of cotton that had been charred black in a sealed can over the coals. He learned to hold the char cloth against the flint and strike the steel down at a sharp angle, throwing a shower of sparks until one caught and glowed in the cloth. Then he folded that glowing ember into a nest of dry grass and birch bark and blew it gently into flame. It was patient, practiced work, and a clumsy boy could strike all morning and raise nothing but blisters. But the boy who mastered it never feared a wet matchbox, because he carried the means of fire in his own two hands. Number 9. Seasoning a year ahead. This is the one that could ruin a winter. The single most important thing a boy learned was that firewood is not cut in the fall for the coming winter. It is cut a full year ahead, sometimes 2. Green wood, freshly cut, is nearly half water by weight, and it will hiss and smoke and refuse to give real heat. It needs a long, slow drying in the open air, a process the old folks called seasoning. So a boy learned to work ahead, cutting and splitting in the late winter and early spring, so the wood could dry all through the summer sun and be ready by the following fall. A family that fell behind, that found itself in November burning green wood cut in October, was in for a miserable, smoky, cold winter, and a chimney caked with dangerous creosote. The wise families always had next year's wood already drying, while this year's kept them warm. Number 8. Stacking the woodpile right. A woodpile is not just a heap. A boy learned that how you stacked the wood determined how well it dried and whether it stood or toppled. The pile had to be up off the bare ground, set on rails or stones, so the damp earth would not rot the bottom row. It had to be stacked loose enough that air could move through every layer, carrying away the moisture. And it had to be built so the rows leaned slightly inward and locked together, with the ends cross-stacked like a log cabin's corners to keep the whole pile from sliding into a heap. A good stacker could build a freestanding rick 8 feet long and shoulder high that would stand all year without a single post. The boy who stacked carelessly came out one frozen morning to find his whole winter's wood collapsed and buried in the snow. Number 7. Top covered, sides open. Closely tied to the stack was a subtler lesson that took years to learn by feel. A woodpile must be covered on top to shed the rain and snow, but left wide open on the sides so the wind can blow through and pull the moisture out. Too many people, then and now, got this exactly backwards, throwing a tarp over the whole pile down to the ground, which trapped the damp inside and turned the wood soft and moldy. A boy learned to lay boards or bark or a strip of tin across only the very top, weighted against the wind, leaving the long sides of the pile breathing free. Sun on the wood and wind through the wood, that was the rule. A pile dried this way would lose its water by autumn. A pile smothered under a tarp would still hiss in the stove come Christmas. Number 6. Measuring a cord. A boy had to know his arithmetic when it came to wood, because firewood was bought, sold, and traded by the cord, and a careless boy could be cheated or could shortchange a neighbor. A true cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of wood and air. He learned to pace it off and stack it square so the measure was honest, and he learned to be suspicious of the loose terms peddlers used, the face cord and the rick and the truckload, which could mean almost anything. Knowing how much wood a cord really was told a family how many cords they needed to last the winter, often 5 or 6 for a drafty farmhouse. The boy who could measure a cord by eye and stack it true was trusted to deal fairly at the woodlot, and that trust was worth something in a small community. Number 5. Banking the fire at night. Here is a skill that has nearly vanished from the earth. Matches were precious, and a cold morning start was misery. So a boy learned to keep the fire alive through the night without letting it blaze. This was called banking. Last thing before bed, he raked the glowing coals into a heap at the back of the firebox and covered them over with a thick layer of ashes, sometimes adding one dense, slow-burning log on top. The ashes choked the air just enough to keep the coals smoldering low and slow until dawn. In the morning, he raked the ashes away to find live embers still glowing, fed them a breath of air and a handful of kindling, and had a roaring fire in minutes without ever striking a match. A well-banked fire could be carried for years without ever going fully out, and on the old homesteads, letting the fire die was a small disgrace. Number 4. Sweeping the chimney. A wood fire builds up a black tarry coating called creosote inside the chimney, and a boy learned the deadly truth early. That creosote can catch fire. A chimney fire roars like a freight train and can burn a house to the ground in minutes on a winter night. So every fall before the heavy burning season began, the chimney had to be swept clean. A boy might be sent up onto the roof to drag a weighted brush, or a bundle of branches, or even a sack stuffed with straw, down through the flue to scrape the black buildup loose. He learned that burning green or soft wood made creosote faster, which was one more reason to burn seasoned hardwood. Skipping the yearly sweep was a gamble with the whole family's life, and the boy who climbed that roof in the cold was doing one of the most important jobs on the farm. Number 3. Building the fire itself. After all the cutting and splitting and stacking came the skill it all served, and there was a right way and a wrong way. A boy learned never to dump a big log on a few smoking sticks and expect a fire. He built it in stages, like a pyramid. First, a loose nest of tinder, birch bark or dry grass or fatwood shavings. Over that, a teepee of fine kindling, the finger-thin splinters. Over that, the larger sticks. And only once the flame was strong and hungry did the real logs go on, laid so air could still flow between them, for a fire needs to breathe as much as a man does. He learned to leave a gap, never to smother the flame with too much wood at once, and to lay the logs with the bark side down so they caught easier. The Forest Service teaches this same teepee and air gap method to this day, because the rural boy's fire building was simply correct, and no one has improved on it. Number 2, reading the weather to read the woodpile. A boy learned that firewood was not just a chore, but a calculation against the coming cold, and he learned to read the signs the old folks trusted. A heavy crop of acorns and nuts, thick coats on the horses, hornets nesting low, woolly worms banded dark. All were taken as warnings of a hard winter ahead, a winter that would eat more wood. He listened to the old men and watched the sky, and he laid in extra cords when the signs ran toward a long freeze. A family that misjudged the winter and ran out of wood in February faced a genuine crisis, burning fence rails and furniture, sending boys out into the snow to cut green wood that would barely burn. The boy who learned to read the season and stack accordingly was practicing a kind of arithmetic of survival, and getting it right meant a warm house from first frost to spring thaw. Number 1, knowing the whole cycle by heart. And the greatest skill of all was not any single task, but the way they all fit together in a boy's mind into one long, unbroken cycle. He understood that the wood he split this spring would warm him next winter, that the snag he marked today would be felled next month, that the kindling box filled tonight lit tomorrow's breakfast fire, that the chimney swept in October prevented the disaster in January. He carried the whole turning year in his head, the felling and the bucking and the splitting and the stacking and the seasoning and the banking, each task in its proper season, each one depending on the last. This was not a hobby and not a chore. It was the deep, patient rhythm of a life lived close to the land, where warmth was not bought with the flip of a switch, but earned with the sweat of summer against the cold of winter. A boy who knew the whole cycle by heart was no longer a boy. He was a man his family could count on, and the fire on the hearth was proof of it. These 25 skills kept families alive through winters we can barely imagine today. Try just one this season. Split a little kindling by hand, find a piece of fatwood, bank a fire overnight, and see if you can wake it in the morning. Then come tell me in the comments which skill surprised you most, and whether your own grandfather knew the firewood rhyme, because these were never just chores. They were knowledge, handed down around the woodpile, father to son. They knew. Now you know too.